Now continuing on with part 3 of Animator friendly rigging. Again, we're still working on bipedal rigs. So bipedal rigs that have 2 feet or 2 heads. So people animation rigs. Could be a monster, could be a people, could be an animal that happens to walk and talk. Doesn't matter. But basically we're looking at characters that have 2 arms, 2 legs, body, and torso like this. If you remember from part 2, we separated the body up into sections with a noise where the head popped off and we got the torso. We worked on both the head and the torso in part 2. And then we've also got the arms and the hands and the legs and the feet. So what are we going to work on next? Well, we worked on the torso first because it was the thing that was moving around the most other body parts. The torso moves, and that means that the hands are going to move, and the arms are going to move, and the legs are going to move, and the head's going to move. So what about the head? Or then we moved on to the head because that's the most, or the most next expressive part, is making sure that the head is doing the right thing. So now we move on to the arms because they are the next most expressive thing. You use the arms for gesturing and all sorts of stuff. But in order to figure out what it is that the arms are going to need to do for the character, it's important for us to look at animation reference and film reference and movie reference and any kind of reference you can get. If you're going to sketch ideas for what the arms should do, you can do that. If you go out and shoot yourself doing things, you can shoot yourself, running around acting like a crazy person, kind of like we did for the parkour animation challenge, as I like to call it, where a bunch of us ran around San Francisco. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of movies from that, and please pay no attention to the shiny lycra and headbands. We're doing it for your benefit. So if you take a look in the movies directory that comes with the DVD, you'll notice that there's a directory in there called arms. So open that up, and then you'll see there's a couple of movies there with arm reference. In this first one here, we have Bryce running forward, and you can see his arm reaching forward, and then boom, the arms plant on top of this wall here and push up. He spins around, plants the hand again, and then continues another plant, and then look at this hand right here as it rolls right off. Whoop, and off he goes. So looking at this movie, you can tell that there's some things that we need to do. First of all, we need to have the arms be able to swing around and move, free of anything. They need to be able to plant, like so, on something and act solid, kind of like almost like a foot. They need to be able to spin around and face any axis, plant again, and they need to be able to roll, like that. Here's another movie. This one is of me looking like a complete moron, but that's okay. I do this for you. So here again, I'm planting my hands, rolling, and then notice the roll and twist there. Another plant. Now the arms are moving freely. And here we go. This movie is of Jason Osipa from Stop Staring Facial Animation Frame. And you can see here what his arms are doing is they're just swinging very naturally. And then they reach up and grab something and swing naturally. So again, this is another thing that arms need to be able to do, is just swing, reach, grab. A lot of transitioning between swinging free and holding on to things. And finally, here's Carlos Puertolas pushing like crazy, trying to get going on his wheelchair. And here you can see how he's reaching and grabbing and reaching and grabbing and reaching and grabbing. And this is the best little bit right here. I love this little part. So he comes forward and then suddenly stops, and watch this arm, his screen left arm, goes flying out, and great little overlapping action there. It just looks totally fluid. Ooh, like that. So we need to be able to do stuff like that as well. So again, switching between the hands being locked onto something and the hands being free. You want the hands to be able to gesture and move around and do all sorts of things. So we can come up with a couple of statements. Basically, we could say that the arms are extremely expressive and they're integral to defining a character's personality. Almost like any part of the body, but the arms vary much to find how a character gestures. A lot of times in animation we think about gesturing and you know, you think of like a typical stereotypical Italian character where they're always gesturing with their arms and doing things, or um, you know, somebody can be fidgeting with something. If they're nervous, maybe they'll be scratching their face or doing something like that. They really do add a lot to a character's personality. So let's come up with a couple of rules. Here are the requirements that we're going to need. First of all, we need forward kinematic control for general gesturing. Basically, this is allowing characters to walk around and just sort of swing their arms, move them, you know, swing when they're walking, move the hands and kind of gesture and twirl the fingers and twirl the hands and stuff like that. The nice thing about forward kinematics is it allows you to get really nice clean arcs. It's easy to manipulate. It's fast to use. And animators understand how to use it. So forward kinematics is definitely an important one. We also need inverse kinematics, which means we want to be able to place the hands on surfaces, like a hand on a table or a hand on the floor if you're running around like a parkour person. So we want to make sure that the hand can be locked in space, and inverse kinematics is the way to do that. We also need to think about situations where a character maybe locks their elbow down on something. For example, if you're holding a glass of wine or something like that and you're resting on the table, you're going to be placing your elbow on the table. If you don't lock that elbow onto the table and then you move the torso, then the elbow is going to move around, and the animator has to counter animate that, which can be really difficult and really time consuming and very frustrating and enough to make you crazy. So we want to be able to lock the elbow down with both FK and with IK, so that if the character is going to be swinging their hand around freely but locking the hand or the elbow on the table, we don't want to have them animate the hand with IK because that can be more difficult than it needs to be. On the other hand, if the character has their head sitting in their hand, um, and their elbows locked on the table, we don't want to have them try and counter animate the FK hand to line up with the head. So we need to have it work with both FK and IK. We also need to have shoulder control because without shoulders you can't do things like shrugging and stuff like that. You've got to be able to move your shoulders. A lot of people, when they first start animating in CG, don't animate the shoulders correctly, and you must. You've got to look at what the shoulders do. They're super expressive, so they've got to be used. Gotta. Very important. Another thing that we're going to look at is something called isolation of FK arm rotation. We'll get into why that's necessary in a little bit, but I found that um, when animating in FK especially, if you get your FK arm doing something that you like, and it's very specific, and then all of a sudden you decide you need to tweak the torso and change the tilt of the shoulders, that can change the animation of the FK arm, and then you've got to modify it, and that can be frustrating. So being able to isolate that FK arm rotation is super important. And finally, sometimes it's necessary to stretch the arm in order to get the exact pose you want. So we have to allow for stretching both in FK and in IK. So one of the things that you've probably noticed by now is that before we actually start creating a rig for our character, I like to explore the quote-unquote toolkit. This is where you go when you try different things. You look at the requirements that you've developed for your rig or that you've decided on, and you try out different ideas to make sure they're going to work. As I said before, I do this kind of like I practice scales on a piano. Before I go and play a huge concerto or play some Bach or Beethoven, not that I can, but if I were to, then what I would do is I'd first warm up by practicing my scales. Um, Same thing with rigging. Before I go and I start creating a character, I warm up and I figure out what it is I'm going to do by just creating a few IK arms or a few FK arms and try moving them around and try some ideas. This way, our scenes are kept very clean when we go to work with our character because we're not trying things out and possibly leaving extra nodes sitting around and stuff like that. So, we're going to go ahead and explore the toolkit by creating FK arms and IK arms and stretchy things and all sorts of good stuff like that. Alright, so let's go ahead. Now there are a couple of requirements that we have for our rig that I want to remind everybody of before we get going into playing with the toolkit. These are things to be thinking about the entire time that we are creating rigs and trying to come up with ideas. They're requirements that we developed and I talked about and starting from Animator Friendly Rigging Part 1, but basically they are, first of all, simple controls. We want to make sure that the controls are as easy to use and as simple as possible for the animator. It's really tough to animate and it's hard to keep yourself in that mindset, so if the animator has to take their mind out of it in order to try and figure out some complicated technical stuff or mumbo jumbo, if you want to call it, it's too difficult. So you want to keep things as easy as possible. The animation needs to be easily transferable, meaning if you change the model or change the rig in some way, you should be able to copy the animation from the old one and place it on the new one without having to work around too many hoops. Um, Controls should be unique and make sense. The animator should be able to look at the rig and see exactly what it is that they're doing and what they're meant to do without actually having to think about it. The control should have the correct rotation order. Again, this is super, super important. We'll be talking about this a lot with arms. Rotation orders are key, and if you have the wrong rotation order, it can make your life a living HE double hockey sticks. The control should be named correctly. I hate it when I open up a rig and I see cog 472A, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Or NURB sphere 27, shape 5E. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. So, arm control, hand control, leg control, left leg control, stuff like that. Things that are easy to understand. And you only want to be able to set keyframes on controls you want the animator using. If they set keys on things that they shouldn't be animating, it's going to be slowing down their scene. It could get messy. They might end up deleting things and changing keys that they don't want to change, and it could just get horrible. So these are things that we want to keep on top of as we're creating our animation rigs. So let's go ahead and pop into a front view, and we will create the arm by going to Skeleton. And I'm going to hold down the X key because that'll allow me to snap to grid points. And we're just going to click and click like that. So we have one joint segment that goes from here all the way to there. Then what we want to do is actually break this up into the upper arm, lower arm, and the hand. You guessed it. Right. So we'll choose the split segment joint tool that's up here on the shelf. Click OK, so it's in 3 segments. And then the proportions on this aren't quite correct. So right now the upper arm, the lower arm, and the hand are all the same size. So I'm just going to take this lower arm and maybe stretch it out a little bit, take the hand control and bring it back like that. That might be a little bit too much. And there we go. We now got a joint segment here that looks correct. We've got the upper arm, lower arm, and the hand, and it's all the right size. Isn't that wonderful? Or to make it easier to look exactly like a real arm, because otherwise it would be crazy. Alright, so our next step is to actually rename the joints. If we take a look at what we've got here in our outliner, go back to our front view, you'll see that we've got joint 1, seg underscore 1, joint 1, seg underscore 2, joint, and joint 2. That doesn't make any sense. People aren't going to know what those are, so let's go ahead and rename them. If you just double click on it, we'll call it up arm, low arm, guess what, hand, and then hand end. I like to name the last thing end just so I know that it's something I'm not going to be selecting and playing with. So here we've got our joints, but it doesn't really look much like an arm, and we can't really tell. For example, if I take this guy and I go into a perspective view here and I start twisting it, it's hard to really tell that it's being twisted and what's going on. So what we want to do is actually add geometry to the joint so it's easier to see what's happening. So if we select up arm, low arm, and hand, and then go over here to our Add Geo to Selected Skeletons button in the shelf, we can just click on that, and sploink, it adds geometry, complete with shaders and everything. Like that, so we can see what's up and what's down. Cool, so we've got our geometry. And what we're going to do now is just check our rotation orders, because basically we have here an FK arm. So easy, oh my god, I can't believe how easy that was. Woo! So let's check our rotation orders and make sure that they're doing the right thing. We'll select up arm, and we're going to rotate it down so it's pretending like it is resting along the side of a torso. So I just grabbed that and rotate Z and moved it down, foink, like that. And what we're going to do is pretend we're walking with the character. So if I walk forward and back and forward and back, And you can see that the arm swings very, very naturally. So that's pretty easy. Not too bad, right? I can swing like that. I can lift the arm up and reach forward. I can reach backward, forward and backward, do the hokey pokey, etc. And notice that now I'm using, with the rotate mode, I'm using gimbal. People go back and forth about whether or not they want to use gimbal or local or world or whatever. Some animators will sit there and animate in local and they'll be like, well, why can't I do like this? Well, if you look at Animator Friendly Rigging version 2, there was a big discussion that we went into about gimbal versus local versus world, etc. And like I said then, I recommend you always animate in gimbal mode because then you know exactly what your arm is doing and you know exactly what type of interpolation you're going to get between two different controls or between two keys. You know what they're going to do because you can see what those controls are doing when you move them. I know that if I go set a key here on the rotate Y and I set a key here on rotate Y, it's going to be a smooth interpolation between the two. I know that it's not going to do anything crazy. So, we like this rotation order so far. It works great. We can twist the arm and we can still swing it and it's looking really good. So I think the rotation order that we have on the arm by default XYZ actually works pretty well for the up arm. So let's check the rotation of the lower arm. So we'll go ahead and grab this lower arm and we're going to rotate it in Y. And yep, that's the elbow, so we can bend it and stuff like that, and that looks totally fine. In fact, we can get really nice overlap pretty quickly just by, for example, coming here, saving a key. Let's go to like frame 10, save a key, go back to frame 18, save a key, and we've got this animation here. And then we could just do the same thing kind of with the lower arm. So I'm going to save a key like this, and then as the arm swings forward, we'll break it back. And then as it starts to go back, we'll bring the arm forward this way. And you can see how very quickly we get nice overlap in the arm. Just like that. So let's go ahead and delete this animation because you are not here to watch me animate. You're here to learn to rig. Yay! So we'll get rid of all this stuff. Cut that. Go back to frame 1 and set these to 0. Oops. Just set rotate Y to 0. And we'll set this one to 0. Okay, so we know that that's somewhat working FK-wise. And now what we want to do is we've got the arm rotating 90 degrees, so that kind of works. But notice what happens here. As soon as I bend it to 90 degrees like this, I can't swing the arm out this way. I can go up to the upper arm and twist it like that. But there are some times when you've got animation on your up arm that you really, really like, and you're doing this big move, and all you really want to do is just break the lower arm out. You want to just crink it out to the side. And right now with our rotation orders the way they are, we can't because there's nothing available to do this. So if you remember how rotation orders work, the last letter over here on the right hand side is the one that's going to carry all the other ones with it. So for example, right now we're in XYZ. So if I take Z on this guy and move it, you'll notice that X and Y move with it. And then Y will move, then X and X will move nothing because it's XYZ. So if we change this rotation order so that Y instead moves everything with it, we can choose either ZXY or XZY. So ZXY works like this, where Y will move X and Z with it. Notice now I can do that, and it works fine. Or I can choose XZY, where Y moves everything with it, and I can use Z like that. So which of these two should we pick? Well, if you consider that when you're animating along a joint, the very last rotation that you want is the twist, because that's going to be the most consistent. That means that I know that when I come in here and I twist the wrist, or twist this forearm, the wrist will still be in the same place positionally. that's good. If I go and you do this one, and I say take this, and I go out to rotate Z, and then I do a twist, notice how I get this kind of weird interpolation? That's not what I want. I want twist to happen last, because it's the most consistent, it's the easiest thing to understand for the animator. So if I switch that to X, Z, Y, whoop, and now I use twist, it works just like I expect. So that's the rotation order we want for the lower arm. X, Z, Y, where Y will take the entire lower arm with it. Z will allow it to break out in either direction, and X will twist it, just like that. So let's go ahead and set these back to 0. And you can see that already we've got something that most people don't think about when they're animating or when they're rigging. They don't realize that the upper arm may need to be a different rotation order than the lower arm. It's very important to figure that out. And in fact, what happens when we get down to the hand? Let's go ahead and scale the hand geometry so it looks a little bit more like a hand. This will make it easier to see what's going on. Ka-chunk, like that. So we're going to go ahead and just rotate this up a little bit so we can see what's happening. So here's our hand control. Now, if you look at what the hand does, and the way I make it easier for myself to figure out what rotation orders things should be, is I look at what the axes are doing, and then I kind of rename them in my head. So for example, doing this with Z acts kind of like the hand bending. So it's bending up, bending down, bending up, bending down. If you imagine that the thumb is right here, it makes it a lot easier to see what's happening. So up, down. This would be going side to side, and this would be twisting. So how do you know what rotation order you want to have? Well, if you realize that X is going to be twist, and I twist the hand 90 degrees in X, so the palm is now facing up, notice Z is no longer bend, it's side to side, and Y is now bend. This is confusing for the animator, because they get used to Z being one thing and Y being something else. So if that's not correct, it's going to be very funky. So what we want to do is change the rotation order. So X, because X is orbiting around here, X is going to be the last thing. So we either have YZX or ZYX. So let's try this one. So if I come here, I can now rotate the hand in any direction, and bend is always going to be bending it, and side will always go side. So that's YZX. What about ZYX? Again, can rotate it around, bend will always work, and side pretty much does, or Y pretty much does side to side. But notice if I go and bend this like that, it's now more like a twisting action, and that's not what we want. We really want this to be side to side always. So we're going to switch to YZX so that now it always works side to side, and this will twist. Although, now that I'm watching this, this actually can make it a little bit easier to get into gimbal lock. I go like that, and now I have no control to go side to side or twist it. And in fact, Y and X end up doing the exact same move. So maybe ZYX is a better one to use, because now we can twist. So this is an example where, in general, what I would want to do, or the way I would always imagine it, is that YZX would be the right solution, because then this is always going to be consistent. However, I end up losing a rotation if I do this, if I bend the wrist too far. So it's really up to you. You should check with your animator and see what type of rotation order they like, and if they run into problems, consider changing to a different one. So very important to check out. I'm going to change the rotation order here to ZX or ZYX, because while discovering this, or while working with it, it does seem like this gives me more opportunities to get the hand to do the right thing. Okay? So, looks like bend is always going to be the last thing to happen, which is probably the right one to do. So we have a very simple FK arm here that we can use as the basics, the basis, the basics, for the rest of our toolkit. Let's go ahead and save this. We're just going to save it as arm toolkit 1.ma, so we know what we're working with. Okay? There's another requirement for our FK arms, and it's the ability to have the FK arm have its rotation isolated from the torso. So what exactly does this mean? If we take a look at this image, this will kind of show you exactly what it means here. On this image on the left, we've got Happy McGee sitting here, um, basically with his arm hanging straight down. With no isolation of the rotation of the arm from the torso, notice what happens as you bend the torso over to the side. The arm will just go right down through the body. And the problem is in order to fix this, the animator has to move the arm out. But if they've got some complicated animation in here, maybe they don't have a rotation axis available that will lift this out. Or maybe doing that will make their animation a lot more complicated. So what you want to be able to do is actually limit the rotation of the arm so it will inherit the position of where it should be. Notice when the character moves, it doesn't have, when the character is not moved over, the arm is here. When it is moved over, the upper arm has followed with it. But the orientation itself is independent. It doesn't follow the torso. It only follows the arm itself. This allows us to solve things like a lot of counter animation problems, and it makes for really interesting looking motion. It makes the arm itself feel more like an independent body that the animator has absolute and utter control over. Okay, so let's figure out some way how we can have rotation isolation of the torso. To do this, we're actually going to create a locator that's going to be the parent of the entire arm, and then we're going to create two identical locators. One is going to be the child of the upper torso, and the other will be the child of the body. And by using an orient constraint, we'll constrain the rotation of the arm locator to either the torso or the body. And that will allow us to be able to decide which control is going to control the arm. So to do that, first we need to create a torso to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to a front view, and we're going to create just a very quick torso here. I'm going to move the arm out to the side just a little bit, and we'll create a couple of joints. So go skeleton, joint tool, and just hold down X so we can snap there, and go like that. And then we will segment these joints, say make 3 of them as well, which will be fine. And then we're going to rename these. So this one will be torso 1. This is torso 2, torso 3, and torso 4. You can have as many torso joints as you want. In this case, we're only going to use 4. Then what we'll do is go to our perspective view, and we're just going to create a locator. So go to create locator, and I'm going to place that right here at the joint using V for point snap, like that. Now what a locator is basically just an object that sits in space somewhere, and it's got this little icon like that so that we know that it's locating something. It just looks like a little cross mark or plus or something like that. And we're going to go ahead and name this locator, and we'll call it up_arm loc for up arm locator, and we're going to parent the upper arm to that locator just by selecting that, and hitting P. So if we take this locator and move it around, you'll see that the arm moves with it. Yay! Very exciting. And we'll parent up arm locator to torso 4. So if we move the torso bits, we'll just grab those and rotate them, you can see the upper arm moves with it. Basically all we've done here is done a bit of fancy parenting. Just it would be the same thing as parenting the up arm to the torso, except in this case we've got a locator, which is the parent of it. Why do we have that locator? You will see momentarily. As we take this up arm locator and we duplicate it, and we're going to delete everything that's the child of the duplicate. So now we've just got a locator that's exactly the same as up arm loc, and it's called up arm loc 1. And we'll rename this to up arm torso orient, like that. And then we will duplicate that, and we're going to call this up arm body orient. So we have 3 locators. We've got the up arm locator, or a locator that represents the up arm itself. We've got an up arm torso orient, which is a locator that's that controls the orientation for the upper or for the torso. Sorry, not controls the orientation, but a locator that we'll use to tell this locator to follow the torso, and this one's to tell this locator to follow the body. Now we're going to parent up arm body orient torso 1 because that's basically the same as the body, like that. And we're going to create orient constraints. So notice this torso orient is a child of torso 4. This up arm body orient is a child of torso 1. Now, what we're going to do is select the up arm body orient, and then up arm torso orient, and then up arm loc. And then we'll choose the constrain orient option. And what that does is that creates an orient constraint for up arm loc and says to follow either the up arm body orient or the up arm torso orient, depending on what the weights are. So for example, right now, if body orient is set to 0 and torso orient is set to 1, the upper arm will follow this object's orientation. And because this is a child of torso 4, it'll follow along with it. If, on the other hand, we change this so that the body orient is set to 1 and the torso orient is set to 0, when we rotate these, notice how the arm doesn't change its orientation. And that's because we're telling up arm loc to just follow the body orientation itself. If we grab torso 1 and move it, it will move around because that's where up arm body orient is a child of. So let's set those back. So they're both set to 1. And let's remember our very first rule is to make sure that controls are easy for the animator to work with. Now for them to be able to choose what object they want the up arm to follow, whether they want to follow the torso or the body, currently they have to actually go to the orient constraint option, and then they have to understand what W0 and W1 are and how the weights work and all that stuff, and that's just way too hard and way too confusing. So we're going to create a control for the constraint instead. And we'll do that by choosing up arm and go channel, add attribute, like that. And we're going to name this attribute orient. We're going to call it an enum, which basically means that we can create names for it, so we don't have to do with weighted, weighted values of between 0 and 1. And we're going to choose name of torso, and we'll create a name here called body, like that. So there's two different options. If I click OK, you'll notice that torso shows up, and I can choose either body or torso, just like that. Makes it really easy for the animator to know exactly what it is they're going for. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll use that to derive a set-driven key relationship of the orient constraint. So if I select these two and go set-driven key, like that, then I can grab the upper arm and choose load driver, and there's the orient control there. And then I can go here and say, well, if it's on torso, I want the torso weight to be 1 and the body weight to be 0. So we'll key that. If, on the other hand, I change this to body, then I want to go back here and I want body to be 1 and torso to be 0. And I key that. Close it. And now I can choose if I want body to be the control. I just go like this. Sorry, if I want torso to be the control. Now if I want body to be the control instead, I can simply switch it like that. And the animator has total control over it. So this is a quick way of setting something like that up. Let's go ahead and save this. So we'll just, there we go. So you're going to find that most of the time the animator is going to want to work with the arm either in body or in all mode, if you allow for it, which means following basically nothing except just the major top control for the character. However, there's a bit of a problem with this system that you'll encounter when if you have the arm in body or all mode and you twist the body, there's no way to get the arm to rotate around the y-axis. So let's take a look at this problem and how it manifests. First, let's go ahead and add some geometry to the torso. So we'll just select torso 1, torso 2, and torso 3, and click on the Add Geo to Selected Skeleton button, like so. Let's just scale the geometry a little bit so it looks more like an actual torso instead of these boxes. So we'll scale this one out like that, take this one, maybe a little bit bigger, and let's give this character some broad shoulders, so we'll do that. There we go. Now we've got our lovely torso, and watch what happens when we actually twist the torso, and if we take a look at the arm, make sure the arm is in body mode. So we'll grab torso 2 and torso 3, and let's rotate it in X. See how the arm doesn't follow? That's great. That's exactly what we want. But the problem is, if we twist this, say 90 degrees here, and then we grab the upper arm and we want to align the arm with the torso, like that, we can do it, but now Y is actually not rise anymore. Y is not swing anymore. It's actually rising the arm up, and now we can't swing it forward. And that's because we don't have a global. If we twist this back to 0, what we really want to do is actually get the arm, say for example if this is like that, we actually want to be able to bring the entire arm around and keep it in the same orientation as it currently is, but be able to align with the shoulder. Does that make sense? So again, here we've got the arm working exactly how we want. We can rise it up and down, we can swing it, we can twist it. But if we happen to take the arm, or the torso, and we rotate it 90 degrees or even 45 degrees, there's no control for us to rotate the entire arm the exact same way. We basically want to do that with the arm so that it aligns itself with the shoulder, but gives us all the gimbal controls that we want, and that doesn't allow for it. So what can we do? What is the way that we get around this type of problem? So there are actually two different ways, well, really three different ways we can solve this problem. The first way is to change the rotation order on the arm to provide the axis that we need, and the second way is to add a node above the arm for orbiting the arm around the y-axis. The third way is just to kind of ignore it. But we're going to take a look at the first two options and see what kind of benefits they provide and what limitations they have. And then it's kind of up to you to figure out what the best solution is for your animators. So let's take the first look at changing the rotation order on the arm and see what that gives us. So if our problem is that we can't actually orbit the arm around this y-axis, the solution is to change the rotation order to give us that y-axis to animate around. So right now our rotation order is XYZ, so if we change it to something like XZY, you can see that now we have that y-axis to go around, because that first Y rotation is the one that's going to carry everything else. So if we were to take the upper arm, or the torso, sorry, and rotate it 90 degrees, we can then grab the upper arm and rotate it 90 degrees, and we get the exact same orientation, and the arm's in the exact same space that it was. We can then go ahead and rise and twist. But the problem is that we lose the ability to swing the arm forwards and backwards. So animation-wise, this kind of sucks, basically. Not much fun. So, you know, what you gain is the arm can pretty much go in any direction. It can orbit very easily in 360 degrees, and it can lift up and down, and it can twist. So getting to most poses, you can pretty much get to any pose you want. You can lift it, you can orient it, you can then twist it. So we could do the swinging thing, and then maybe use Z to do it, but you're going to end up with some strange interpolations, and it's actually not going to be that easy to work with most of the time, and most animators will get kind of confused by it. So that's kind of the problem. And you lose some simplicity from it, basically. So you can achieve any pose, but you can't swing as easily. Another option is to add a second node above the arm. So let's go ahead and take a look at doing that. We'll just undo all the way back. Boom, boink, like that. And set us back to XYZ. So we're back at the default. And what we're going to do is add something called an orient node. And this node is going to end up being above up arm, but below up arm loc. So it'll still react to the space options that we have here, where we're either following torso or body, but it'll allow us to orbit the arm however we want. Okay? So here's how we go about adding that. First thing we'll do is we'll just simply input. You can pretty much grab anything you want. So we're just going to import a arrow control for us. And we'll choose a circle arrow from our icons directory. If we grab that and take a look at it, it looks like this. We can simply just take this, position it right there, scale it however you want. We'll parent that right underneath up arm loc. and freeze the transformations on it. Just for everything, freeze transforms, like that. So we can select it. Let's get it. And we'll call it up, arm, orient. And then we can basically take up arm and parent it directly to that. So now we've got up arm orient. And what that lets us do is then we can pose the arm using our regular controls the way we want with our XYZ default rotation order. Take the torso, twist it around however we want, and then just grab up arm orient instead and rotate that 90 degrees to whatever angle we want, like that, so that it orients with the torso, and then we can go ahead and animate the arm within that space. So what does this give us? Basically, it gives us the ability to animate the arm however we want and then change the space that the arm is animated in completely separate from the arm's animation itself. So which method is better? Well, it's up to the animator. Some animators hate the idea of an extra control. Some animators, and they just want to force the rig to work how they want to work, and they don't really care as much about rotation order. Other animators really enjoy the ability to get exactly what they want and don't mind an extra control if it allows them to stop having problems along the way. So, are there other solutions? Yeah, definitely. You can. This is having this solution is definitely where you run into the problem of having a control that works the way you want, but it's a bit too complicated. It's great. It's really nice to have the ability to orbit in any direction, but will an animator really use it? Maybe, maybe not. So what can you do to combine the functionality of this dual node into one? Since Maya allows only for 3 rotations on an arm, you could, and you need 4. It's basically you need, rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z, and you need this orbit on top. What you can do is add an extra attribute on the upper arm called orbit and use it to animate the orient control itself. So you could just go in here and choose channel, add attribute, add orbit, do a direct connection directly to this, and then the animator can be on the one control or one object and do it. That'll work fine. Another thing that you could do would be to make it so that the twist on the arm actually happens on one joint down. So you still have 2 joints, but the top joint it basically acts like the orbit control, and then the other rotation axes, and then there's another twist further down. But for me, it's like I like to keep things simple. So I like it like this, where you can take the arm, you can animate the arm doing whatever it is that you want it to do, and then you have a separate control that'll allow you to orient the arm in whatever space and whatever angle you want. For me, that makes the most sense because I think about the arm as an object where I'm animating it doing something, and then when I want to make sure it aligns with the torso correctly, I can grab a separate control and work with that, and I don't have to worry about everything overlapping, and I don't have to worry about it getting too confusing. Okay? Now, is this going to be easy for every animator to work with? Not at first, but after a while, you get used to it pretty quickly, and it's not that difficult. So let's just go ahead and reset these all back to 0. We'll take the up arm orient, change its rotation to 0, and we're going to save this as the next version. Version number 3. Just like so. So here's some of the things we've explored so far. We've created an arm, we're checking rotation orders, we looked at isolation of rotation, adding an extra orient control. The last thing we want to look at is scaling the arm. So why would you ever want to scale an arm? What's the point? Well, when you're animating, a lot of times animators like to fake their motion so it looks great directly from the camera they're working on. And when they do that, sometimes they need to scale out either the upper arm or the lower arm to get the exact silhouette that they want. You can either scale it so the hand seems bigger and it looks like it's coming out more towards camera, or maybe they just, in the middle of a move, really want to have a great smear frame where the frame just kind of goes like, wah! And in order to do it, the arm has to scale out a certain amount. And I'm a big fan of allowing animators to have this type of control. You need to be able to do this sort of thing. So you want to be able to allow for scaling. But the problem is you don't really want the animator to use the actual scale attribute to control the length of the joint. And there's a couple of reasons. One of them is because of shearing. Another one is because things tend to break. But let's talk about shearing. what is shearing? I'm not talking about going out and finding sheep and actually, cutting off the wool and making money doing that. If you want to, you can. That's cool. I'm not into it, personally. I like getting the wool. I don't like the shearing part of it. What I'm actually talking about with shearing is when a geometry distorts itself based on non-uniform scaling. So, for example, an object in Maya, let's just create a cube real quick. Yay, a cube. Has a scale attribute, scale x, scale y, scale z. And when you rotate it, that object scales with or rotates within its space that it exists in. So if a space is scaled to 1, 1, 1, it's uniform. That means no matter what you do to the object, it's going to be looking the same in x, y, and z in terms of the way it appears. So it's the same size in every direction. However, if you scale one side of the space, for example, if you were to scale scale y up, let's actually create a locator and do this so we can see what it does. If we were to take p cube, parent it underneath locator 1, and if we were to take locator 1 and scale it up like this, you'll notice this cube scales as well. And if we take the locator and we rotate it, everything looks fine. That's because the locator itself is interacting in a world space of 1, 1, 1. But p cube 1 right here is working in a space of locator 1 itself, which has a scale of 1, 2.1, and 1. So if we were to rotate p cube 1, watch what happens. See how the geometry shears? Like that? That's because it's rotating within a distorted space. So even though we can take locator 1 and rotate it, and that's what we want, but if we take cube 1 and rotate it, we get that. This is actually doing the right thing. It's just rotating within this non-uniformly scaled space. So if you're doing this with your joints, if you have a joint and you create it and then scale it out and then try and rotate a lower joint, you may end up with some shearing and stuff like that with some of the geometry further down the line. This doesn't always happen, but I can 99.99.9% guarantee you at some point it can break. So you just really, really, really don't want to get in that situation. Usually it'll work totally fine until you try and go into FK and IK snapping and match the two, and then something doesn't work and it turns out to be a non-uniform scale problem. So for us, we don't actually have to hook up the scale of a joint to control the length of it. We can use the translation of the child joint. So let's go back and reopen up the scene. And notice here, if we were to take this child joint, and we're going to go to the translate X, we can translate it, and that looks like it's changing the scale of the joint itself. Because if you remember right, the way Maya's joint system works is a joint segment itself is actually made up of a position and an ending, a location here and a location here. And the length of that is based off of the translation of the child joint, and that controls the length of the segment itself. So let's go ahead and find a way for the animator to work with that. Now, you could just say to the animator, if you want to scale out this joint, go ahead and go down to the child joint and then grab the translate X and move it. But again, this isn't the most simplified control. That doesn't make sense right off the bat. If you were to grab a joint and say, I want to change the scale, would you think I'm going to go to the child joint and change the length and translate X? No, you'd think I want to change something called, I don't know, length maybe. So let's go ahead and add an attribute, and we'll call it length. And we're going to make it a type float because we want it to be like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, etc. We're going to set a minimum of 0 because we don't want to go negative. We're not going to set a maximum because I don't want to give any limits to the animator, but the default value is going to be 1. So a length of 1 is going to be its default length, so it's easy to go back to whatever its default is, like that. Then what we're going to do is connect the length to the length of the bone itself, and we'll do that using a set-driven key again. So we'll select translate X, go to set-driven key, select this object, load that as the driver, scroll down until we find length, low arm, length of 1, set-driven key, translate X, 0, key. Boink, like that. Then let's go to the upper arm, and we'll set a length of 0, like so. Go to the lower arm, and we'll set its translate X to 0. Boink, key. So now, if we go here to the length, and click on it, middle mouse button drag, I'm dragging it very high amounts here, so I'll hold down Control, and you can see how it'll actually move up and down along that geometry. Now this isn't scaling the geometry itself yet, it's just scaling the bone. But using the length, it's pretty easy to figure out what it's going to do. But, as you can probably tell, it's a bit distracting not having the geometry itself move with the scale of the joint. So what are we going to do? Well, we want to actually attach the scale of the geometry to that length attribute. Now, as you remember earlier, I said scale is bad, but now I'm saying hook up the scale. No, that's okay. It's okay to hook up the scale on the geometry because the geometry isn't driving anything at all. It's just there for visual representation. It's not something the animator really cares about, or at least it's not something the rigger cares about in terms of how it's going to affect anything else. All it is to be visually pleasing for the animator. So that's okay. We can do that. We can scale it however we want. So what we're going to do is we're just going to connect the length attribute to the scale of the geometry, and we want to hook it up to the scale scale X. So we're going to go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. We'll click Reload Right on the geometry, Reload Left for the upper arm itself, and I'm going to tell it to only show me keyable attributes. Then I'm going to click on Length, and we're going to choose that to drive the scale X. So when I grab the length here, now when I scale it, you can see that it's allowing the geometry to scale. But look what happens if I go past 1, because we want to scale long as well as short here. The geometry keeps going because it's hooked up to the length, but the joint itself stops. So we need to tell the joint to continue going past that length of 1. And how do we do that? Well, luckily, we have ability to control this animation curve. So if we select this joint here and we bring up our graph editor, you can see that the translate X is being driven by the up arm length attribute there. And if we look at infinity, if you go under View, Infinity, Always, View Infinity, boink, there we go. We could see what happens after value of 1. So when up arm length gets up to 1, you can see that the result here, translate X, stays at 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell this to continue along linearly in that direction. We go to our curves, we go to post infinity, and now we can tell it what we want it to do. We want it to be linear, so it'll continue along past that. So now, if we were to grab length, we can scale up and down, and you'll notice that it'll drive the length of the arm correctly 100% of the time. And the animator now has total control over the length of this upper arm to get exactly what they want. So that wasn't too difficult to set up, but there's an easier way to do it. Because if you do this a lot, it can get tedious to have to add length all the time and do all that stuff by hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a script that's available in your that comes with the DVD, and it's called the JS_set_driven_key length.mel script. Or if you click on your SDK length button up here on the shelf, you can do it. So we'll select low arm, click on that, and it'll ask you, please decide how to hook up the length, because I don't want to assume that everyone wants to hook things up based off translation or scale. I want you to be able to decide. Of course, I recommend translate, so we'll click on that, and then it says, would you like to scale any child geometry? Sure, why not? I will say, yes please, and it'll automatically do that. So now, when I click on length, woo, it works automatically for us. See how easy that is? Much easier. Yay! And what it does is it actually connects the scale of the first non-joint child of the selected joint. So if you want your geometry to scale, make sure that it's the first child that isn't a joint. And what that means is, boop, if I go here and open this up, because low arm geo is the first non-joint child of low arm, that's the thing that's going to get the scale control. Okay? So let's go ahead and disable some of the attributes we don't want the animator to use. Because again, we don't want them to select things that we don't want them to work with. I don't want them to grab up arm orient and translate it away, or scale that, because who knows what that's going to do. So we have to tell the animator that they're not going to use those things, right? So we will select the up arm orient, up arm, low arm, and hand, and we're going to choose the translate Y and Z and all of these scale controls here, and we'll do right mouse button, lock and hide selected, so they can't get to it. Okay, then we're going to select for the hand and the lower arm the translate X, and we're just going to do hide selected so we don't have to see that. On up arm, we'll do lock and hide selected on the translate X, and we should probably do the same thing with the visibility as well. So we'll hide that on there. On all these guys as well, we're going to select visibility and radius, hide those. What else we got? We have orient and length in there, we've got length on there, and rotation. So now we've got only things that we want. Oops. On up arm we need to lock and hide that as well. So on orient, we've only got rotation available, which is what we want. And in fact, most of the time you're probably only going to want rotate Y. So we'll lock and hide all the other ones. So we just have rotate Y to change that orientation. On the arm, we've got rotation, orient, and length. On lower arm, we've got rotation and length. And on the hand, we have rotation. Cool. The animator can't manipulate anything we don't want them to manipulate. Let's go ahead and save this. File, save scene as, and we will save this as ARM Toolkit 4. So we can always go back to it. Sweet! Now that we've created a forward kinematic arm, let's go ahead and take a look at an IK arm and see how that's going to work for us. First thing we're going to do is create it and then work on some stretching and elbow locking and other different options. For those of you who don't know much about inverse kinematic arms, remember that basically the idea with the inverse kinematic arm is that it's going to measure the distance between the wrist and the shoulder, and then it'll bend the elbow appropriately. So instead of like forward kinematics where you rotate the upper arm and rotate the lower arm to get the position of the wrist, you just move the wrist itself and it calculates the rest for you. So open up a new scene and let's go into Maya and just draw a quick arm here. We'll go to a side view and then go to skeletons, joint tool, and we'll just go ahead and create, again using X for snapping to a grid, we'll just create an IK arm like that. Then we want to put an IK handle on the arm. So to do that, go to Skeleton, IK Handle tool, and take a look at the option box. You'll see there are a couple of settings that you can use for current solver here. There's a SC solver or single chain solver and the RP solver or rotate plane solver. The single chain solver or IK-SC solver is a great way to use, a great solver to use when you're not too concerned where the elbow ends up in space. It'll handle the bending correctly, but it may orient itself differently depending on what object the IK handle is parented to. So for example, if you're just going to measure the distance of something between one point and another point and you want to get the orientation, an IK-SC solver will work great. For arms and for knees where you want specific control over where the elbow or where the knee ends up, the IK-RP solver or the rotate plane solver will work better because you can specifically tell the solver to work in a specific plane, meaning the rotate plane. So for example, if we were to use that solver and we create an IK handle by clicking on the start joint and on the end joint, notice when I translate the handle, the elbow bends. And if I rotate the view here, you can kind of see the plane that the elbow is always bending in. It's always going to be between the hand, the elbow, and the shoulder, and it doesn't ever deviate. If I hit T to turn on my little tool manipulator here, I can actually rotate the plane of that bending by grabbing the little thing up on the top, the pole vector right there. Or I can grab the bottom and spin it this way. So that then, if I move this and hit T, move it over here, go back and move it, you can see how that affects where the elbow goes. We can actually have more explicit control over the rotate plane solver itself, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But first we want to rename the joints, because right now having things named joint 1, joint 2, joint 3 aren't going to make any sense to us. So rename joint 1 to up arm, just like we did on the FK arm. Joint 2 will be low arm, and joint 3 will be hand. And we're going to rename the IK handle to arm handle. Okay, so in order to create the position, or in order to control the position of the elbow, we're going to create a node that the animator can move around and have the elbow point at it. It's kind of like using that T control that I was showing you earlier, except it's going to be much more explicit and less hidden, because an animator who doesn't know Maya is going to have no idea that they can hit T in order to control the elbow. They'll just be like, what? Like that won't make any sense at all. So let's add an elbow control by creating a locator. So we go create locator, go over to side view here, and we'll just position that locator out around the elbow. Let's also rename the locator. We'll call it elbow. And now, if I select elbow, and I select the IK handle, and go constrain, and scroll all the way down to pole vector, you'll see the pole vector takes it draws a line from where the shoulder is, or where the upper arm is, over to the elbow itself, and lets me know that when I'm manipulating, if I grab this thing, it's going to aim the elbow directly at it, like that. So this node itself is now what controls the plane that the IK handle solves in. Basically, it's an aim for the elbow. Let's go ahead and create a locator for the hand as well. So again, we go create locator. We'll rename this to hand loc, and we're going to parent the arm handle to the hand locator itself. So now I can grab the hand locator and move that. I can grab the upper arm and move that, and I can grab the elbow locator and move that around. It's a very, very simple but effective arm setup. So having this basic IK arm is great, but watch what happens if you stretch the hand locator too far. Go ahead and grab it and just stretch it. So yeah, the arm is bending, and then pump, like that. It just stretches out. The joints can no longer reach the locator, and we want them to. We want the joints of the arm to be able to stretch as far as the hand control is. I mean, imagine you have a character pulling on an object, and as soon as the arm goes straight, the hand leaves the object. The animator is going to spend a lot of time fighting and trying to keep the hand located on the object while allowing the arm to be straight. For animators, having a straight arm versus a bent arm is extremely important. It really helps define the motion. And if they're constantly fighting to keep that arm straight without it popping or without the hand swimming all over the object, it's going to drive them crazy. And like I've said before, our main goal is to keep the animators from being nuts, because they are nuts enough as it is. So if we allow for a little bit of stretching, it's going to allow us to take care of this problem and make it much easier to deal with. So how do we actually tell the joints that they're allowed to stretch? Well, the way to do it is to actually measure the distance between the shoulder and the hand control, and then scale the joints based off the distance. So here you can see we've got the up arm, the low arm, and the hand, and the distance between the up arm and the low arm is represented by the letter A. Between the low arm and the hand is represented by B, and the distance between the up arm and the hand is C. So what we want to do is we want to measure the distance C between the up arm and the hand, and then scale A and B as necessary. But the problem is you can't just scale the upper arm and the lower arm based on how far the distance is here, because if you just go ahead and start scaling them as the distance increases, the arm's never going to straighten and never going to bend. Because as I pull the hand away, these two will just grow and shrink, and it's not going to look correct. What we want to do is make sure to check the distance, and as soon as it adds up to the length of the upper arm and the length of the lower arm together, then we can start stretching them. If the distance is less than those two, then the arms won't stretch at all, and it will just bend. So how do we measure the distance between the two? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at using a nice tool in Maya called the Measure tool. We can get this by going to Create, Measure Tools, Distance tool, like that. And what we're going to do is click at the very top of the upper arm. Again, by holding down X, you'll be snapping to the grid. And then we want to click again at the hand, right there. You'll see now that we've got this Measure tool, a little distance dimension tool here. It says it's got 8 units. There's a locator at the top, and then it's actually automatically using the hand locator. That's one of the great things about the Measure tool, is that if you click where there is a locator, it's going to use that locator itself automatically as part of the calculation. However, in this case, We don't want to use the same locator because I want to make sure that everything is named consistently and on its own. So I'm going to undo the creation of that, like so, and then we'll go back to the Create Measure Tool, Distance. And I'm actually just going to create the Distance tool off in space. So we have our two locators. We've got locator 1, locator 2, and we can see the distance between them. I'm going to rename this as arm dist start, and locator 2 is arm dist end, and the distance dimension as arm dist. See how having the naming conventions helps? And then we'll take arm dist start and snap it to the start of the arm. Arm dist end, we'll snap it to the end like that. And then we're going to parent the arm dist end control to the hand locator, and we're going to parent the upper arm to arm dist start. You don't want to parent arm dist start to the upper arm itself because the upper arm's scale, or the rotation of the upper arm, is going to be controlled partly by what's happening with the arm dist start control itself. So if you have the upper arm rotating and then being affected by the arm dist start, you're going to end up in a loop. And I talk more about loops a little bit later. So don't worry if you don't know what a loop is, you will find out. So let's see what this does. If we grab hand loc and we move it, notice how you can see the distance changing? You can actually calculate exactly how far apart these two things are. So now what we want to do is actually use set-driven key to control the length of these joints based off of the scale of, or the distance between here and here. So we can use a set-driven key command to do this, but the problem is it's a little bit difficult to do by hand. So for example, let's give it a shot and you can see where inconsistencies and some limitations are going to come into play. If I go ahead and select the lower arm control and the hand, and we're going to grab the Translate X, and we'll choose Set-Driven Key, like that. The Translate X attributes for the hands are going to be the ones that are changing. Then we'll grab arm dist itself, pick walk down to the shape, and load that as the driver. So we can go and find distance, because the distance here is what's going to be controlling that. So we'll key that because we want these to be bent when it's at this distance here. And then I'm going to take the hand locator and I'm going to scale it, like translate it out until it's roughly straight. The problem here is I don't know exactly when this is going to be straight. I can kind of get it close, but I'm always going to be off by a few decimal points. But let's just see what happens. So we'll say it's going to stay straight there, and then we'll scale this along, say to here, and then select the lower arm and the hand, choose the Translate X, and then just translate them a little bit longer. And again, you can see I can get close to where the locator is, but it's going to be a little bit off just because I'm trying to do it by hand and that's not an easy thing to do. Key that, and you can see how this is working somewhat. It'll stretch and it'll bend, but if you look at the hand in relation to where the locator is, you can see it's kind of slowing down and catching up, and it's really difficult to work with. So using this method will work, but it's going to be really hard to get it to line up exactly. It's much easier if we take advantage of the fact that we have the ability to program things in Mel and do this programmatically as opposed to trying to do it by hand. So let's go ahead and do that. So don't worry if you're not used to coding in Mel. I'll go slowly and this isn't too difficult. And the commands and everything are all in your documentation, including explicit definitions and explanations of what's doing what. So here's what we want to write our program to do. We want it to measure the length of the upper arm, and we're going to save that as a variable called upArmLength. Then we're going to measure the length of the lower arm, and we'll save that as a variable called lowerArmLength or lowArmLength. Then we're going to create a set-driven keyframe on the translation of each of these joints, where if the arm distance is less than the sum of the up arm length and the low arm length, then we'll set the scale to 1, basically. We'll leave them alone. If the arm distance is greater than the length of the upper arm and the lower arm, then we'll tell the scale to be equal to the distance. Okay, so we're going to execute a couple of Mel commands and we're going to save some variables. So the first thing we want to do is set some variables for us to use. The first one is going to be a float value, and it's going to be called up arm length, and we're going to say it's equal to 0.0. You don't have to explicitly declare the float variable itself to be 0.0. If you just say float up arm length like this, that usually works, but sometimes I found that there's some bugs in Mel where if you don't say that the float is actually 0.0, it won't actually realize it's a float and it'll start treating it like an integer. So I just like to explicitly declare it. Makes it easier to read as well. So low arm length is equal to 0.0 as well. Full length is equal to 0.0, and driver is going to be arm dist shape dot distance, like that. So here's what we've got with our variables. We've said, and if you don't understand what a variable is, don't worry, we'll be getting into those a bit more later as well. So we're declaring a float value, meaning 0 point something, or 1.1, or 2.5, or 6.793412, something like that. And we're saying we're going to call it up arm length, and at first it's going to be 0. Lower arm length as well is also going to be 0, and the full length, if I spell that correctly, is going to be 0. We're also declaring a string variable of the driver that's going to be the same thing as arm underscore dist dot distance. This is just so we can access it later and make it easier to include in any scripts that you create on your own. So now what we want to do, that we've declared these variables, if I just execute this, I can do things like print driver. If I execute that, you can see that it results with actually printing out the name of the driver. Or I could say print up arm length, or whatever you want. I could do print, let's see, say full length is equal to up arm length plus 5. And I'll say, oh, okay, now full length is going to be equal to 5. Great. And then we could do something like full length equals full length divided by 2. So here I'm accessing the same variable, dividing it by 2, and it gives me 2.5 as the result. And now if I printed full length, like that, you'll see I get the result right there. So this is how we're storing variables and actually using them again later. But we're going to reset all that stuff, so it's all by default. And now what we want to do is get the length of the upper arm and the lower arm, and we're going to use the translation x attribute because it gives us the distance. Right now we don't want to use the scale because that'll mess things up later. So we're going to grab, in order to get the length of the upper arm, we're going to grab the translate x value of the lower arm. So we're going to grab the lengths. So we'll say up arm length equals, and then I'm going to use a mel command called getAttr, low arm tx. And what getAttr does is it allows you to grab any attribute value at any point. So for example, let's say I wanted to find the radius of up arm. If I past tense of type, getAttr up arm.radius, like that, and execute this, it's going to tell me exactly what this value is. And notice it goes to a higher degree of basically the float goes back a lot further here because it goes to 0.652466 as opposed to 652. So we can use getAttr at any point. Notice here with up arm length, I'm getting the lower arm.tx, and I'm enclosing it in these little tick marks here. There's one before it and one after it. What that does is basically tell Mel that I want to execute whatever is in here and grab the result and toss it back into this variable. It's important to do that. If you didn't have this, these little tick marks, it would error out because it wouldn't know what to do. So just by putting those tick marks in, it says, oh, okay, everything between this is a mel command. So I want to grab that and stuff it into this variable. So if I do that, you'll see I get a result. And now I can do print up arm length, like that. And it'll tell me, oh, the up arm length is 3.94762, etc. So we'll do the same thing for the lower arm. Lower arm length equals getAttr hand.tx. Now notice I'm not actually writing an expression, so some of you who are familiar with expressions may be thinking that we're going to use this later as an expression that's going to be run and evaluated every time the scene evaluates, and that's actually not what we're doing. We're literally writing a script to help us set something up. So this is something I recommend that you guys do quite a bit actually when you're rigging your characters, is write scripts to do things like this, because you can get very specific about what you want, and you can make sure that you can repeat this exact same thing over and over and over again without getting bored, because you don't have to spend the time doing it by hand. Now we're going to get the full length. And basically what we're saying here is the full length, meaning we want to allow, while basically the distance between the shoulder and the hand is less than whatever the full length is, we're just going to leave these guys alone. But as soon as it gets greater than that, that's when we're going to start scaling. So we'll say the full length is going to be equal to up arm length plus low arm length, like that. So if we evaluated all of this, we know now that when full length is 8.223724, the arm is going to be completely straight. Okay, so as soon as this distance gets to that value, that's when the arm is straight. That's why it's so hard to do this by hand, because for you to actually physically move that so that the length here is at 8.223724 is nearly impossible. I can't do it. You might be able to do it. I can't do it. But now what we want to do is create the set-driven key command. So create set-driven keyframe commands. So the way the set-driven keyframe command works is it looks something like this. Basically, it says, here's the command, set-driven keyframe, and then here are all the options that you can send it. You give it the current driver, which is the driving object and attribute. In this case, that's going to be the distance on the, or basically the distance attribute on the distance node. The driver value, so when it's, let's say we wanted to do something like the driver value was 1, we wanted to do something specific, you would set the value here to be 1. The attribute that we're going to be affecting, or the driven attribute, which in this case would be the translate x of one of the joints, and then the value that you want it to be, and then you tell it all the driven objects. So for example, here's what one of our set-driven keyframe commands could look like. Set-driven keyframe current driver arm dist underscore shape dot distance, the driver value 5, the attribute value translate x, we want it to be a value of 1, and we're going to affect these objects. So what this is saying is, when the arm dist shape distance has a value of 5, I want you to set a keyframe on the translate x of these objects to be a value of 1. Okay? So let's see how we would do that here. I'm going to do set driven keyframe, and then we're going to do the current driver. It's going to be $driver. Now this is why we created this this variable here. It's because I really don't like retyping arm dist shape dot distance over and over and over again. So we're just going to instead reference the variable, which makes it a lot quicker. Say driver value full length. This is the variable that we figured out right here, and what we're saying is when the driver value is at the full length, we want the attribute translate x, oops, put that in quotes, to be a value of up arm length, and we're going to put this on low arm. So what this is saying is when the current driver, when the up arm dist shape, or the arm dist shape, sorry, is at a value of whatever the full length is, the upper arm itself, the translate x of low arm, is going to be this value that we've got right here. So we're setting its default value. Okay? And we're going to do the same thing for the hand. Copy this, paste it. We'll say the current driver, when it's at full length, the translate x value is going to be low arm length. And we're going to put this on hand. So if we execute these commands, execute the entire thing, you'll notice now if we select this joint, it's got a keyframe on it, on the translate x. that's because we're doing a set-driven key. And if in fact we take a look at our animation editor graph editor here, you can see that the translate X will have values now. And it'll say arm shape distance and low arm translate X. See that? It's getting set up for us. Cool. So now we want to tell it what to do when we're past that. So when it's 2 times the length. So we'll go set driven keyframe. We're going to say when the current driver of the disk shape is going to be the full length times 2. Put that in parentheses like that. So basically we're saying now when this is set to 2 times its maximum length, because it's much easier to evaluate how this is going to work if we just pick a number and say, okay, it's going to be twice the length. Well, we know that we want that lower arm or up arm length to be times 2 right here as well, like that. And we'll do the same thing for the hand. Full length times 2, translate X, low arm, and hand, like that. So we'll execute this one right here. There we go. Now if we take a look at the curve editor for the low arm, you can see that we've got a curve that goes right through like this. So what we've done is we've measured when it's at twice the length, and we automatically set a set-driven keyframe for it. But you'll also notice that the tangents are a bit funky in here. So what I'm going to do is select the hand and this, and we're just going to take these guys and set them to linear, like that. Okay, just to keep it simple. And we want to do a quick little thing here at the end. A rule that says the scale of the joints will be 1 when the length is 0, just because it's important to have that. We'll copy these ones, paste them down, and we'll say the driver value is 0, like that. The attribute translate X is going to be up arm length still, like that, and the same thing here. When the length is 0, the value is going to be lower arm length. Okay, now let's just double check and make sure that these are doing the things that we want. If we go ahead and play with this first, see if it's working. The arm works as it's supposed to when it's bent. Then as we go straight, see how it stretches, and it matches exactly what we want. But if we go twice its length, you'll see it stops stretching. And that's because of what's happening with our animation curve. If we take a look at the curves again, for the lower arm and for the hand, take a look at the graph editor. Under Window, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, you can see how if you go to View Infinity, you can see how infinity just sort of carries on flat like this. We want to make it consistent. So if we go to Curves, Post Infinity, Linear, it'll continue along the linear path that we've specified there. So now, if we select the hand locator, stretch it out, it'll stretch forever. Doesn't matter how far we go. And it'll always line up because we did this programmatically instead of trying to do it by hand. So really quickly, just explain how the set-driven keyframes work again and how this little script works. What we did was we set the initial variables for the up arm length, the low arm length, and the full length, and the driver. And we set them to just be their default. So every time we run this, it'll reset everything from scratch. Then we grabbed the current length of the upper arm and the current length of the lower arm, and we added those two together to get our maximum full length for what the arm should be before it does any stretching. Then we use the set-driven keyframe command to say when the driver, or when the length is as long as the full length, so it's when it's at its maximum without stretching, we're going to set the translate X value to be the length of the upper arm for the lower arm there. So we want to make sure the upper arm is at its default length as long as the full length is the upper arm and the lower arm added together. Did the same thing for the lower arm. Then we went and we multiplied the full length by 2. So we could say, okay, when the hand is twice as far away from the shoulder as it is when it's at its maximum extension, we want to then take the value of the upper arm and multiply that by 2, and the value of the lower arm and multiply that by 2, and save those. Then we set it at its default for 0. Then we went to the graph editor for those joints. Graph editor. And we told it to continue on infinity once it got past its extension, because we wanted to keep stretching no matter how far away the person pulled it. And that is how we got our curves, our stretching to work on our arm. So let's go ahead and save this as a version. We'll just call this arm toolkit 5. There we go. Cool. So now we've got stretching arms. We've got an IK arm that can stretch. We've got an FK arm that we know how to work with. Let's talk about locking the elbow. So when we start talking about elbow locking, we're not going to worry about skinning and how all that's going to work yet. I just want to talk at first about the interaction and actually think about what it is that we need the elbow to do and what we mean by locking the elbow down. In this case here at the sketch, you can see that we've got a character leaning forward with his elbow placed on the table and then his hand being able to move freely from it. One thing I really like to do when trying to figure out how to create a rig is just sketch a few ideas and try and think about the structure of what the character has for a joint structure and how you might best want to manipulate it. Like what would be the most optimal way of working with that scene. And in this case for the elbow, I was thinking, it would be really nice to be able to take a locator or some sort of control of some kind and place it on the ground and then try and figure out, well, if it's placed there, what do I want to do? How do I want this arm to react if the torso bends forward and backward? And how do I want to be able to control the lower part of the arm? So I figure if you take the torso and you pull it back, you don't necessarily want the elbow to move at all. You want to be able to control that, because if you would expect that, if the torso bent all the way back over this way, then maybe the elbow would slide. But if the torso just moved a tiny bit, you don't want the elbow to be sliding backwards and forwards. You want the animator to have control over that so they can lock it down specifically if they want to. So I realized that it's really important. This point of contact right here on the table, this point where the elbow's touching, is very important. So the animator has to explicitly be able to set that. But once they do set that, what about the angle of the forearm? Well, again, I don't want the forearm to necessarily be affected by what the shoulders are doing or what the torso is doing. I want that to be controlled by the elbow and by the animator itself. I don't want to have to counter animate. If I want the hand pointing a certain way, it doesn't matter to me if the torso is going to be going up and down. I want to be able to control that myself and not get automatic animation. So if we look at what that means we need some sort of control where we've got an upper arm going and pointing at an elbow, and then that shooting off a forearm that then the animator can bend up and down and probably orbit as well, because what if you want to actually take this thing and swing it around in Y like that? So we need some way to be able to twist that. But there's another type of elbow solution we need to take a look at. What happens if the character is leaning on the table and has their hand on their head? You don't want to have to counter animate that with forward kinematics to try and get the hand to line up. You'd like to be able to take the hand, parent it to the head, have the elbow locked to the ground, and then move the character as necessary and have those things line up. Leave it to the animator to make sure that the arm doesn't look like it's stretching too much. So we have two different solutions that we need to look at. Let's take a look at the second one first, because it's actually not that complicated to solve with the current rig that we have. Basically what we want to do is tell the control that, we've got a locator here for the elbow that we can move around. We know the distance between the shoulder and the hand. We also know the original distance of the upper arm and the lower arm. So what we can do is say, give the animator control that says lock down the elbow, and then instead of scaling the upper arm and lower arm based off the distance between the hand and the shoulder, we're instead just going to say, hey, you know what, upper arm, your length is going to be from the shoulder to the elbow location, and lower arm, your length is from the elbow location to the hand, and that's it. And so it's basically just a slider that we can use to blend between those two different types of options. So let's go ahead and implement that first and see what it's like. So the first thing we want to do is create a couple of distance tools to help us keep track of what things need to be. So let's create a distance from the upper arm down to the locator on the elbow so we can measure this distance right up here, and we'll do the same thing for the distance of the lower arm. So if we choose our measure tool, distance tool, and remember what I said before, if you click somewhere where there's a locator that already exists, it's going to use that locator instead of creating a new one. So here I've clicked on the arm dist start control for that locator, and I've clicked on the elbow control for that locator, and it automatically uses those two to create a distance for that. So we're going to go ahead and rename that, and we'll name it to elbow, or let's see, up arm to elbow dist. It's a long name, but it's really descriptive. I can look at it and go, I know exactly what that's measuring. Yay! And then we'll do the same thing for the lower arm. So we'll grab from that one to that one. And we're going to name this one, oops, it created a new locator accidentally. So we'll undo that. Let's create it again. So we click on that, and then we click on that. There we go. And we're going to call this one elbow to hand dist. Okay, so we've got the length of the upper arm, we've got the length from the upper arm to the elbow, and the length from the elbow to the hand. So now that we have the distances, we want to set up a rule that will stretch the arms to the elbow using that distance. But we can't use the set-driven keyframe method that we use for stretching the arm because we're not just measuring one axis. We're not just measuring this distance here. We're actually going to be measuring, or we actually want the arms to scale independently of each other based on wherever this elbow is. We can't just have them both scale at the same amount. So we're going to fake the scale by using a translation. So this is actually much more simple than it sounds. What we'll do is we'll tell the joints translate x to choose the distance to be either the default length and the scale thing that we set up earlier, so basically the system that we have now, or to make the length be the length between the upper arm to the elbow or the elbow to the lower arm. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, you currently have a network, and you can see here in the hypergraph, you currently have a network that does all this stuff to control the translate x. It measures the distance between the shoulder and the arm, goes through a set-driven key, and then that drives the translate x. So use either that network, or instead just literally look at this distance right here and use that, because we're measuring the distance but to get the translation. So let's go ahead and see how we can actually manipulate our graph to allow us to make this choice. So first things first, select the lower arm and then go graph input connections, and that'll show you just the incoming connections for the lower arm so you can see what's affecting the translate x. Again, we've got the arm distance shape, the start and the end, going into the distance node itself. That distance attribute is driving a set-driven key, which is then driving the translate x. So we've got another thing here. We can choose the up arm to elbow dist, and we're going to pick walk down by hitting the down arrow on the keyboard. And we want to add that to our graph. So actually, if we go to display shapes in here, you can see the shape. This is where that distance attribute is. I'm just going to drag that with the middle mouse button directly into my hypergraph. And you can see now that adds the up arm to elbow dist shape right into the hypergraph, and you can see that it's actually using the arm distance start shape and the elbow shape to figure out the distance there. So what we want to do is we want to interrupt this connection right here, and we want to tell the animator that they have a choice. They can choose either this length, this distance here, or they can choose this. For example, if right now I connect the distance directly to the translate x, what it's going to do is it's going to make it so this always is the length between here and here. Now it's not going to line up exactly because I haven't done it to the lower arm yet, because it has, in order to make it work right, it has to happen on both the lower arm and the upper arm. But that's basically what I want to do, is tell the animator either pick this control or pick this one. So what we're going to do is create a node called a blend to adder node, and that allows us to make a choice between the two. So in order to do that, we're going to type in our script editor here. let's go ahead and remove all that. We'll type create node. This is a command that allows you to create a node in Maya. Blend to adder, like that. That creates the blend to adder node for us. Okay? That's right there. Attributes blender, blend to adder. If you zoom back, you'll see that the blend to adder automatically gets added into your graph. So I'm going to grab that, and let's just go ahead and rename it. We're going to call it up arm choice. So when you look at it, you go, oh, it's the thing that makes the choice between the two. So what the blend to adder node does is it allows you to actually put two attributes going into it, and then the animator has an animation control to blend between those two values. So for example, if the value of this input here was 1 and the value of this was 5, then you'd have the 1 going in here, you'd have a 5 going in here, and then you'd have a blend between those two values, and the animator could choose either 1 or 5 or any value in between. So we're going to go ahead and connect to that choice node. We'll grab the lower arm translate X right here into the up arm choice. So we'll go whoop, like that, choose other, show non-keyable. I want to grab the output, and that's show non-keyable, and we're going to put that into the input. And when I click on that, it adds input 1, or sorry, input 0 automatically. So you can see here, it's connected. So if you don't understand what the input bracket 0 means, the brackets basically mean that this is an array. You can have as many of these inputs as you want normally. Right now on the blend to adder, it's only 2 available. But you could basically, if you ever see something like this, it means that you can have multiple connections going in. So in our hypergraph, you can see we've got the lower arm translate X value going into our choice node right there. It's going directly into it. And what we want to do now is add the upper arm going into it as well. But unfortunately, if we were to grab and drag just like that and do other, and then say we want the distance, we want to put that in the input too, you click on that, it also goes into input 0, which breaks the connection from the other one and replaces it with this one. So why does it do it? It's one of the bugs with Maya's connection editor. It doesn't know how to handle multiple inputs very well. So we're going to go back and make sure the output goes into the input there correctly. And notice what happens when I actually make that connection. There's a command that gets evaluated in my script editor. Connect adder -F for force, lower arm translate X dot output to the up arm choice dot input 0. So instead of trying to do it with the connection editor, I'm just going to go ahead and force the connection using a mel command. So what we can do is we can say connect adder, excuse me, I just sneezed. Okay, we can choose connect adder, force, we'll choose the up arm to elbow underscore dist shape distance to up arm choice input, and we'll choose 1. Execute that, and now you can see that both are connected. So that's one way of doing it. Another way, if I undo all that, is to actually say, you know what, in the script editor, if we just wanted to tell this guy right here that there had to be another input option like that, if you do this, believe it or not, you do set adder up arm choice input 1 to 1. So what I'm doing is the set adder command, which is very similar to the get adder command, except instead of retrieving an attribute, it sets it. We're just going to fake it and say, hey, you know what? This input bracket 1 that you don't know exists, we're going to set its value to 1. So I'm going to do that. And then if I select up arm choice and I reload right, you'll see that it actually goes, oh, I have another input value here. So I can use that. So we'll go ahead and connect those. And we'll say distance. It's going to go into this now suddenly existing input 1. So you can do this either way. You can either do a set adder on the input 1 that you want, or you can just do the connect adder directly and connect the two. But now we've got this choice node in between the up arm to elbow dist shape and the lower arm translate X. You can choose which one of those you want. using this attributes blender here. But now we want to connect this to the translate X on lower arm. So we'll do that. To other, we'll choose the output, and we'll scroll down until we find translate. Connect that to the translate X. And now you can see how this choice node comes between the two, like that. So by default, it's still going to work the way it was before. Move this around. Oops. I had the wrong thing grabbed. Okay, so by default, if I select hand loc and I move it, it works just like how it did before. No change there. But if I go to this choice node and I dial in attribute blender, set that to 1, when I grab this guy, the upper arm is now going to be the same as the length between here and here. Unfortunately, it doesn't look right until we actually set it to work on both the upper arm and the lower arm. So we have to do the exact same thing on the lower arm. Or sorry, for the lower arm. So I'm going to rebuild the graph. And I'm going to select the hand and rebuild the graph again. So now here is our graph for the lower arm. Right there with the up arm choice node and our entire node network going into it. We've also got the disk shape here handing into the translate X on this guy. And we've got the choice node there. I'm going to duplicate the choice node using Control D, because it's much easier to duplicate something that you want other than having to recreate it from scratch. Like that. And we're going to rename this to low arm choice, like so. And we want to do the same thing that we did here. So we have the up arm to elbow disc shape. Let's make sure we grab the elbow to hand disc shape, and we'll drag that in. So we've got that guy there. Here's our choice node. And what we'll do is we'll take this one, and we're going to drag that, the hand, onto the lower arm one. We'll connect the output of the hand to the input 0 on that one. And then we'll do the elbow distance to the input 1. And then we'll take this one on the choice and connect that to the translation. So the output to the translate X, like so. Let's rebuild these two so we can see more clearly what's going on. So here's our choice node for the lower arm. Here's our choice node for the upper arm. And again, by default, I grab this and I translate it, and it works how it's supposed to, how it originally worked. And if we go into our choice nodes here, we select both of them, and we set them to 1, you can see now that if I move that around, the elbow will lock to that locator. But again, the animator is not going to be able to find those two nodes very easily, so we need to set up a way to make it easier for them to blend between the two options, because it's all about making it simple for the animator. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the elbow itself, and let's add the stretch control to that. So we'll choose Add Attribute, and we're going to call it something easy to use like stretch. We'll set a float value of minimum 0, maximum 1, default is 0. Correct. Okay. And now we want to connect the elbow itself to the choice nodes. So we'll go to our General Editors, Connection Editor. With the elbow selected, we'll reload that. You can see down at the bottom there's that stretch attribute. Then I'm going to pick this choice node right here, and we'll say the stretch is going to drive the attributes blender. We'll take this choice node, reload that, stretch drives the attributes blender. So this one stretch node now controls both of the choice nodes. And as I drag between 0 and 1, you can see we get that behavior. If stretch is on 1, I can grab the elbow and it locks. If stretch is on 0, I can grab the elbow and it does nothing. I can grab the hand at any point and work with that. And in fact, I could be stretched all the way out like that, And then as soon as I grab the elbow here and go to stretch, whoop, it'll stretch it. And we can go anywhere in between the two. So this gives the animator a ton of control. They can suddenly, when in IK mode, grab the elbow, lock it down, and the entire arm will stretch to their satisfaction. So let's go ahead and save this current version here. File, save as. We'll call this arm toolkit 6, like so. And now we know that we've got a IK system where we can lock the elbow down and keep the hand in IK mode. But what if we want the forearm to be in FK? What if we're in this situation where the elbow's locked down, but the forearm really has to move around and go crazy? We don't want to have to animate this in IK because maintaining this arc is going to be very, very difficult. So as the hand's moving, obviously it needs to move in an arc. Doing that in IK, not so easy. So we need some sort of FK system. Well, luckily, it's not too difficult to do that. All we have to do is create a node under the elbow that is the position that we want the forearm to be in when we're in quote-unquote FK mode, and we tell the hand control itself, the hand locator, here to either follow the hand when it's in IK or follow this FK control. And then we can just rotate the elbow and get exactly what we want. So how do we create a control that's going to be the exact right length for us? Because we don't just want anything that's like, we don't want a locator that's, I don't know, here, and say, okay, follow that control, because we don't know it's going to be the exact right length for the forearm. So we need to create an FK forearm that's going to work for our elbow. So the way to do that is we're going to just duplicate our lower arm, like that, and we're going to rename it low arm elbow joint, like so. And we're going to parent the lower arm underneath the elbow joint, or underneath the elbow control. Boink, like that. And it sits right there. Okay? Now, we want to position the lower arm elbow joint so it's located at the elbow itself. So I'll hold down V for point snap, and it'll be right there. And we're going to orient it how I want it to be when it's 0. So just something like this. It doesn't have to be exact. We're just testing out theories in this case. Remember? That's why it's great to try stuff before we actually do it, because we don't need to be exact. We don't know if this is going to work yet, so instead of spending all this time trying to get to be exactly right, let's make sure that the theory works and it feels good before we spend time working on perfecting the system so it's exactly right. But let's say that's where we want the elbow to be. And in fact, I'm going to actually move the elbow control so it's directly on the joints, just like that. And you notice it's been a bit difficult to read all this stuff because of all the distance controls visible. We're just going to hide those for now. Make it a lot cleaner, a lot easier to see our scene. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to tell this hand locator, let me hide the shapes, we want this hand locator to either be here when it's in IK mode, or we want it to be snapped up here to work in FK mode. So we're going to create a hand control. We'll just go create NURBS primitives, circle, and this object is going to be our actual hand orientation control that we want to work with. So I'm going to orient it 90 degrees there, and we'll freeze the transforms under modify freeze transformation so everything's zeroed out. And we're going to name it hand anim. Okay? Then we're going to create a hand control for the FK elbow. We're going to duplicate hand anim. We're going to position it over here at the end of the elbow, and we're going to parent it down there underneath low arm elbow. Right here. Poink. And we're going to rename that. We'll call it hand elbow anim. Okay? And now we're going to tell this hand control itself, hand loc, that it's going to be constrained either between hand elbow anim or hand anim. So we'll select hand anim, select hand elbow anim, select the hand locator, and we'll choose constrain parent. I'm going to go to the option box here, make sure maintain offset is off because I want it to literally follow those two positions, and click add. And now you'll see it's halfway in between those two. If I take this elbow control and I rotate it, it's going to give me some of the motion of that. If I take the hand and I move it, it's going to give me some of the motion of that. Cool. But we want to add a blend option so we know whether or not the elbow is an IK or FK, so it knows which one of these to follow. And we're going to put that on the elbow itself. So we'll select the elbow. We're going to create an attribute, and we're going to call it forearm. And we're going to set it to an enum value so we can tell the animator exactly what it's going to do. We want it to either be FK or we want it to be IK. Because we don't really need the animator to know the underlying structure between what we've got. All we want them to do is go, hey, when I have the elbow selected, is my elbow in forward kinematics or FK kinematics? I'm not sure. So now we're going to use set-driven keys. Or actually, no, we can use the connection editor to do this. So we're going to grab the parent constraint, go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, like that. Click Reload Right. And then we're going to grab our elbow, like so. Grab Reload Left. We'll scroll down to forearm, and we're going to use that to control the hand anim weights and elbow weights, the constraint weight. So we've done this before using set-driven keys, but I want to show you a way of doing it with the connection editor itself. So we'll connect the forearm to hand anim weight 0, which means that when the forearm is in FK mode, which is basically going to be the value of 0, it's going to follow the hand anim. When the forearm is in IK mode, we want it to follow hand elbow anim weight 1. We want it to go to this one. So how do we do that? Right now it's going to follow both. If I bring up the parent constraint and go to the hypergraph connections here, you can see that the elbow, forearm, and basically is driving both the weight 1 and weight 2. So right now it's halfway in between the two. What I want to do is say when the forearm is in IK mode, it's going to follow the hand. So I need to create a reverse node in here. So we're going to go to Rendering, Create Render Node, and go under Utilities, and you can see the reverse here. Create that. If I pull back, we'll see it right here. And I'm going to drag the elbow onto reverse, choose Other, choose the forearm, put that into the input X, and then we'll grab the reverse node and drag it onto there, and we'll say the output X is going to connect to the elbow anim weight 1. So now, when I'm in FK mode, it works like that. As soon as I switch to IK, the hand now follows this. And if I turn on stretch, and then go into FK mode, you can see, whoop, it works like that. Now we could actually do this with a blend instead of an enum. We could do exactly the same thing we did with stretch and have it turn either on or off with a drag of the two, between 0 and 1. But one of the things I really like to do when it's such a distinct change like this, I like to make it clear for the animator, FK or IK. It's up to you if you want it to be an enum or you want it to be a blend. That's really up to you. And actually more up to your animators to make that decision. But this is just one of the options for how to work with this. But either way, the result is we have an IK arm that can work either in FK for elbow locking or IK, or the elbow doesn't have to be locked at all. Pretty handy. Okay, let's go ahead and save a version of this. We'll call it ARM Toolkit 7. Save. Alright, so what have we done so far? We've discovered that we have a really nice forward kinematic solution. We know how to make sure the rotation orders are correct. We can move the arm exactly how we want. We can isolate the rotation. We've got extra orientation control. We can scale the arm. It does what we need. We've also got an IK arm that can handle stretching and the elbow locking, and then when the elbow's locked, we can be in forward or inverse kinematics. Those are two very different types of rigs, but they both solve specific problems that the animators have. So what do we do? Do we try and combine the two and create one rig that can handle both situations? What happens if we end up with an entire another situation halfway through production where you've got a arm that needs to do something even more crazy? I can't even think of what it might possibly be, but perhaps there's another type of arm that you need to work with. Um, I'm a big fan of making a tool that works for the problem that you've got. Definitely you want something that'll work for as many situations as possible, but we don't need to over-engineer an arm. For example, if you don't need an IK arm that actually has elbow locking, there's no point in trying to add it into the system. So how do we create something that allows the animator to choose which type of rig they want, but not have it be something that impacts the way we set up the final rig? So if we decide we need to add something later, we can add it in and it won't break things. And if we decide we need to pull something out, we can pull it out and it won't break things. Basically, we need to come up with some way to work with forward kinematics, inverse kinematics, inverse kinematics in FK, inverse kinematics in IK. Let the animator choose between all of these situations and give us a resulting arm that's going to be the thing that is what the animator finally ends up seeing and what's actually rendered for our character. So what's the easiest way to connect this display arm or this render arm to the different types of rigs? For me, I figure the best thing to do is look at what common attributes all the rigs have and then base our connections on those. So if you look at an arm, you can look at what features does the arm have. That doesn't matter if it's in forward kinematics or inverse kinematics or who's it kinematics, whatever kind of kinematics we have that we don't know about that may exist in the future. What is it about the arm that's always consistent? Well, there's always an upper arm. There's always an elbow or a lower arm. There's always a hand. And we always want the arm to move correctly between those. We always want the shoulder to aim the correct way. We want the arm to aim the correct way. If we twist the hand, we want the twisting to work correctly. This is where it's important to look back at our reference material and not get too caught up in all the technical mumbo jumbo and craziness. What are we actually trying to solve? We're trying to basically create something that would allow us to control 3 points in space: a shoulder, an elbow, and a wrist, and then the orientation of those things. And that's it.